Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Wired Health and to the Access stage. I agree with Matt, this is obviously the most exciting stage. I'm Morgan Meeker, a senior writer at Wired, and we're going to kick off proceedings today with a discussion about fixing the gender data gap in healthcare. So that phrase, the data gap, it's just another way to describe kind of the blind spots and inequalities in healthcare research. And it's only really recently that I feel like we collectively are beginning to recognise kind of consequences of spending decades studying basically men's health far more extensively than other parts of the population. And part of that recognition is due to the rise of femtech, companies that promise to fill these data gaps with their own research and provide a kind of more tailored healthcare to previously less studied groups. So I'm joined by the people behind some of those companies who are going to talk to us today about the huge data sets, specific data sets that they're gathering, how they help and what they plan to do with them. So before we get started, I'm just going to let everybody introduce themselves and say a bit about what you do. Eileen, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks for having me, and it's really nice to be here. So I'm the executive director of Fertifa. We're a reproductive health benefits company, so we're primarily selling to workplaces in order to support those employees for their reproductive, hormonal, and sexual health.
Great. Tania.
Hi everyone, I'm Tania Boler and I started a company called Elvie. So our mission is to empower women through radical female-first technology, and we do that by looking at neglected issues in women's health and designing products for that. So we're currently in two categories. The first is pelvic floor health, and the second is breast pumping.
Hi everyone, I'm Valentina. I'm the founder of Daye, and we are a gynecological health platform that's centered around creating novel medical and diagnostic devices for two very trivialized areas of gynae health, period pain and vaginal infections.
Great. And so I want to get a sense of, when you all started out, I mean, what did the research look like in your respective fields? I mean, Tania, when you started LV, what did you find when you went looking for kind of the research backing to what you were trying to do?
Yeah, so I'm a researcher by background. I have a PhD in HIV teenage pregnancy. I'd worked a lot in sexual reproductive health. And then it was when I was pregnant for the first time, and I realized there were lots of issues in women's health that I didn't know much about. So that's when I realized pelvic floor health was a very neglected area within the medical world. So I went around, I suppose with research, you've got different types of research which are needed at different stages. So first, obviously, is your consumer research, or also talking to experts, like, is there a problem here that needs to be solved? The answer was yes, there was technology that existed. And then sort of moving on to the product research, which is, how are you going to design a product which solves the problem? So for us, the first product was the pelvic floor trainer, and it needs to fit inside the vagina, which obviously 51% of the UK population have. And as a diligent researcher, I went to look at what existed in terms of how we could design a product which would therefore be comfortable and convenient to use. And I think what was just really shocking, and I think is also symptomatic of this area, is that there were only about 5 studies around the vaginal anatomy at that time, and some of them were very old-fashioned. So there was a complete lack of data, and I think because a lot of women's health issues are quite taboo, it means we don't talk about it, and therefore the consequences are, not so much data, research, funding, innovation, and so on.
And that was 2013, is
Yeah.
that right? I mean, Valentina, Daye was founded 5 years later, and I mean, does any of that sound familiar to you? Was it different by the time you came into the space?
Very, very, very similar. I didn't expect when I was first founding Daye that we would have to conduct as much research and clinical trials and innovation as we ended up doing. For example, for the design of our tampon, I thought that we would be able to just work with some of the existing tampon manufacturers, but through research and meeting with industry stakeholders, I realized that tampons are one of the last greatly monopolized industries out there. So whether you're buying organic or non-organic, they're all made on the same machine in the same facility, and that's why all tampons look and perform the same. So when I first fundraised and when I first started Daye, I definitely didn't tell anyone that we were going to build an entire manufacturing facility by ourselves and machines. But apart from the gap in design engineering and product design for women and for vaginal health, what we discovered is one of our central theses is that you can use the vagina for drug delivery because the vagina is highly absorbent, it has the vaginal mucosa, but it seems that it's the safest and most effective way to deliver medications in women because when you deliver a medication vaginally, it doesn't get recycled through the liver, but only through the kidneys and the pelvic floor. You can deliver a lower dose, the effect kicks in quicker, so there's lots of advantages, but there were only like less than 5 studies on using the vagina as a drug delivery mechanism. So then we had to conduct all of our own clinical trials as well as product design work. And that's really hard to fund with venture capital. I think venture capital is a very, very imperfect mechanism for funding gynecological health and medtech in general, because the expectation is you're going to produce returns within 7 to 10 years. And that's how much you need to design a new product and to clinically validate it. So what we're doing now is combining grant funding with venture capital. So we can use grant funding for R&D and CapEx, and then venture capital for operational expense and marketing.
And you're both talking about coming along into your respective fields and finding 5 studies. I mean, just for context, I mean, what happens if you go into like a much more established field? How many studies have you got to look at?
Yeah, I mean, in men's health, so erectile dysfunction, I think there's 5 times the number of studies in erectile dysfunction versus premenstrual syndrome, even though erectile dysfunction only affects 19% and premenstrual syndrome 90%. But that's because also you're looking not necessarily at the NHS, but you're looking there for the private sector, right? So that's based where the money is going and where you think there's demand. And as Valentina is saying, the problem is we can show that there is demand in women's health in the private sector, but it takes longer than you would in other areas because there's not the data, there's, as Valentina was saying, there's not the science, but then also there's not even a sense of how to market and create demand around these issues where there's taboo and a lack of education.
And Eileen, what about you? I mean, Fertifa has its own clinical research team, is that right? And I mean, is that because you couldn't rely on the research that's out there?
I think there's a few reasons for that, and actually Valentina and Tania have already touched on it. So I came from a slightly different perspective than, you know, fantastic entrepreneurs, but as was already being alluded to, there are investors like myself. So I've been an investor for the last sort of 10, 15 years, wanting to invest more in this category and in healthcare generally, by the way. So I wasn't necessarily looking for female health, but females are 51% of the population. So if one is invested in or wanting to invest in health, you're wanting to invest in women. And I realized there was just a dearth of information about it. There was not enough capital going into it. And it's because for a lot of investors, there was not enough quantification of the opportunity, even though as women, we would argue that you don't need data to tell you how much information and opportunity there is. So one of the things we set about doing at Fertifa was trying to get access to even more patients and individuals and trying to get the data and the information from them in terms of, by the way, through their employers or their workplaces about what questions they had, what issues they might, you know, come into, what kinds of ways they would want to seek support, what that support would look like, and then how we might be able to deliver. So it's a very sort of long-term play for me as an investor, although obviously at Fertifa we see a near-term commercial opportunity as well to address the gap that's not there right now.
And like, why are we in this position? Like, Tania used to work in research. Like, why is it that there's all this data that's missing?
Well, yeah, so there's missing language. There wasn't the word femtech when I started. There's the missing data and the companies and innovation. And they are all linked to what I mentioned before, which is around the fact that a lot of women's health issues are quite taboo, right? So they're to do with sexual reproductive health. I think many cultures have struggled to talk about some of these issues, right? We've come from historically patriarchal societies. And then because it's not talked about, there's also an acceptance that women just put up with this stuff, right? So when I gave birth and I learned about how prevalent pelvic floor health issues are for new mums, it's 80% of new mums. You talk to women in this country and they'll say, oh, it's just a woman's thing, you know, it's normal, I can't jump on the trampoline, and so on. As you go to France and you see it's quite different. So there's also an expectation that women are putting up with a lot of these issues. And there's also a lot of stereotypes, not just around the taboos of women's health, but also stereotypes about how women, how disease play out with women. So there's something called the gender pain gap, right? So men and women can present with the same symptoms in hospital, and men will be seen quicker than women. More often than not, men and women with the same symptoms, women will be given antidepressants. And there's a sense that women are possibly, there's something, mental or psychological that's going on, which clearly isn't the case.
Can I just say, I think all of that is, I couldn't agree more, but I do want to sort of underscore something you said. I do think it's right down to who used to be in control, or who has historically been in control of both healthcare, investment, funding, decision-making, full stop. And so because we've had historically a patriarchal society and sort of men making these decisions, taking these decisions and judging, so the judgment of what's appropriate or what's deemed necessary, we haven't had enough attention on women's health issues. Full stop.
So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg problem. Is it the funding that comes first, or is it the research that comes first?
It's both, right? Yeah.
And it's not a surprise that we're 3 women up here, right? Because as Eileen's saying, most tech companies and investment companies are led by men, so it's kind of natural they won't be thinking about women's health issues, won't be top of mind. And it takes, people sometimes say, oh, could it be a man who's leading a femtech company? Obviously, men can lead companies that do great things for women's health. But because specifically in women's health, we also need to be educating people about it. We need to be changing the conversation. We need to be breaking those taboos. It comes more authentically from a woman as well.
And Valentina, when we last spoke, we were talking about how this leaks into the lab, and you were telling me about how the gap between male and female mice. I mean, just talk a bit about that and how that's affecting us.
Yeah, so when you think about the research gap, you usually think about the fact that we don't have the infrastructure to recruit female participants into clinical trials at the same rate as we can attract male participants. So a lot of the drugs we have on the market today, a lot of the medical devices that we have on the market today were never designed for nor tested on the female physiology. And this is the case for everything from the female Viagra, which was largely tested on male patients, to ibuprofen. And when you talk about the gender health gap and the gender research gap, you mostly think about clinical trials, but the patriarchal view that women should be protected as the vessels of life dates back to animal studies, and we still prefer to use male mice over female mice in animal studies because we're worried that the menstrual cycle will quote-unquote pollute, that's the actual word that's used, and I think that matters, will pollute the quality of clinical data. So we still see the menstrual cycle and the female hormonal fluctuations as something that is a negative, it's unnatural, and it needs to be contained and ignored.
And how do you get around that? How do you get around researchers being so concerned about the menstrual cycle?
Well, something interesting that happened to us at Daye. So the idea for pain, we have 2 products, the pain relieving tampon and the diagnostic tampon. And both of these products are not new as concepts, they're not new ideas. So Procter & Gamble first came up with the idea for pain relieving tampon in the 1960s, but they killed the project because they thought the market wouldn't be large enough, even though, as Tania said, 90% of the female population experience period pain. And then we've known since the 1980s, there have been really good, solid clinical trials since the 1980s showing that tampons increase the sensitivity and specificity for STI screening, so diagnostic accuracy compared to the swab. But there's a valley of innovation death in gynecological health. So even if you have good ideas and you miraculously manage to find the funding for them, because you need follow-on funding and the ability to scale and to reach consumers and to educate them that they shouldn't just ignore their pain, you have a lot of great ideas die along the way. And this is my biggest concern about the femtech space. Most of the female founders that I know who are working in femtech are working in conditions of extreme scarcity. They're really capping the size of their teams, they're really capping the size of their marketing investments, and they're capping what they can invest in R&D because the funding simply isn't available. And I think this will inevitably have an impact on the quality of the products that we're developing in femtech. That's my biggest worry for femtech.
And Eileen, you're also a partner at venture capital firm Passion Capital. I mean, if we need funding to kind of fix this research gap, I mean, how can we get that funding?
Yeah, so firms like mine, but others as well, are trying to do more and more of that. And so even, up the value chain, from limited partners, things like the British Business Bank, which has been our cornerstone investor for all of our funds, they're committing to invest in more female, GP-led firms, and ones that are actually actively investing in what we're calling more diverse investment thesis, even though we're talking about it's more than 50% of the population that's been ignored. So I think it's such a cliche, but it's, you've got to follow the money. And I assume the same goes with respect to research grants, institutions that are funding those grants. And you have to have more and more decision makers that are more and more diverse in those decision-making bodies to try and get more of that capital coming through.
Okay. Just a reminder for our audience, I'm not the only one who can ask questions here. If you want to ask a question, you can go to slido.com and the hashtag is WiredHealth2, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay.
Sorry, just to add, I think, on the research side, as well as what Eileen and Valentina were saying, in the same way we look at the gender pay gap, right? So when you hold companies to account on gender disaggregated data, then that's a sort of naming and shaming element to it. So similarly with clinical trials, there's guidelines now saying that you should have 50, gender parity in clinical trials, and yet that's not the case for some of the reasons Valentina said. It's seen as too complicated around menstrual cycle and too costly. But research institutions need to be held more to account on that. And similarly to what they were saying in terms of startup and funding, it is critical. We're kind of at I hope in the end of a second wave in femtech. I'd say the first wave when I was just starting, and there were a couple of other female entrepreneurs where this thing didn't exist. We had to prove that there was demand, which obviously looking back is a bit crazy. And then the second wave, the last sort of 5 years, has been amazing. There's been this huge plethora of founders starting so many different issues in women's health because it's so many white spaces. And yet, as Valentina was saying, the last 18 months have been very, very hard for this space. So we're seeing funding dry up. We're seeing good innovations falling, and hopefully they will get to another stage where VCs are able to see. Venture capitalists often say patient capital. They all like to say they're patient capital, right? I've not yet met a single VC who is really. Are they? How do we get to a point where VCs are more patient and allow more experimentation and failure around both the science side and the commercialization?
You have to have more diverse investment committees.
Right.
So I think even though the investment community has gotten better about having more female associates or more diverse, full stop, so ethnic diversity as well, different social classes, different pathways, with associates, analysts going to the events and trying to curate greater deal flow, I think the ultimate decision-making body, again, the investment committees, are still very, very homogenous, unfortunately.
As we read in Sifted last week, where a prominent VC investor said that it's too costly to train female investors, that it would cost him 20 to 30 million, so therefore he couldn't do it.
I mean, we could go so many places.
Yeah.
But I would say that doesn't even surprise me as much as, because I believe he was very poorly articulating something he genuinely believed and is flawed, but lots of people believe. I think what's even more harmful to more women in investments and in finance is the fact that we have well-known individuals who have been actually investigated, publicly investigated, called out, and yet internal investigations clear them and they continue holding positions of great responsibility and controlling investment dollars in investment committees. I think that's worse, because then I don't know anyone who wants to go work at that firm, and it sort of perpetuates. I think that's even worse than people saying flawed sort of logic about what it takes to bring in people.
Yeah. And I mean, we could talk for so long about the problem, but I also want to talk about what you are all doing to kind of fill that data gap. I mean, each of your companies have amassed kind of industry-leading amounts of data, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, Tania, do you want to start? What type of data have you been collecting to build your products, and how did you get that data? What does it look like?
So we have a data science and a user research team, so we're continuously essentially making sure that our design products are around putting women at the center of that design, which sounds really blindingly obvious, but actually most medical devices are not designed in that way. And that flows through not just on the research side, but even, for example, our engineers. We have a lot of engineers from Dyson because we thought, well, why not get somebody who's great at redefining consumer category and look at a neglected women's health issue. But yeah, we use the data. I mean, we have a certain design tenet, so it's always about accuracy and convenience, and it's just about constantly, obviously privacy and security is really important for our users, but making sure the data is then feeding back into improving the product. That's kind of your level one, I'd say, of product research. And then the question is also more the clinical trials, say Valentina is talking about, which might also is important in terms of regulation, right? When you're innovating, we designed the first silent wearable breast pump. Can we get a different insurance payout in the US? Or our pelvic floor trainer is available on the NHS. We need to show a lot more in terms of effectiveness. And then I think that the last tier, which is so important and yet hard to do as a startup, is the research collaborations with universities, because we do have huge global data sets, and it's then trying to help not just, startup world is very short term, day to day, hour to hour almost, but working with universities to look at some of that sort of longer term research.
So how do you approach that? I mean, you're a company, you have your own priorities. How do you approach working with researchers who might have kind of different ideas?
Yeah, it's difficult also because my background was in research, right? So I used to run trials in sub-Saharan Africa and HIV, and I just got very frustrated with how slow they were working with government. So I think, even it's a balance, right? Because if you're doing too much research collaboration and you're not looking at your bottom line, then you're not building the platform you want to build. So we've taken an approach of we will look at research collaborations as long as the university is sort of taking the lead. But we wouldn't, for example, it wouldn't make sense for us as a tech startup to be running large-scale scientific studies.
Valentina, does this sound familiar? Because you're also working with academics, is that right, with your data?
Yeah, we haven't necessarily yet encountered the issue where academics want to work on something that we're not interested in, because there's such a wide variety of academic specialties, and there's such a hunger for data and for good quality data on gynecological health outcomes, so what causes gynecological disease, how to best treat it. So we just find the researcher that has a really niche speciality that we're also interested in, and then we make our anonymized patient data available to them so that they can publish papers and help advance modern medicine's understanding of what causes women's health issues and how best to treat them.
So you kind of vet researchers that approach you and be like, do we align in what we're trying to do, and take it from there?
Yeah, and we also send out a researcher newsletter every quarter. So every researcher that I've ever met through working at Daye, I add them to my newsletter, and then they're just up to date on what are our current research interests, and then they respond and they let us know what their research interests are.
And what kind of data do you have at Daye?
So two main data sets. The first one is on what causes period pain, so endometriosis, adenomyosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, chronic pelvic inflammation. And then the other data set is around the relationship between the vaginal microbiome and different gynae health outcomes, so menopause, miscarriage, ectopic pregnancy, preterm labor, chronic pelvic pain as well.
Okay. And Eileen, Fertifa carried out what you described as the biggest ever survey on workplace fertility. I mean, tell me about the data sets you got from that, and how do you approach sharing them?
Yeah, first of all, I'm really proud of what the team was able to do there. And we did that with Fertility Network, which is the largest charity in the UK around fertility and infertility challenges. I will say, though, it was a low bar. And so it's an embarrassingly low bar for all of us in the sector, because just the fact that we were able to get, near to 5,000 respondents made that the biggest ever survey in UK history. So we have been trying to do more of that to try and get more data. But then the other real principal point of our model is that we're trying to work with workplaces to try and get access to as many individuals at a time as possible. It might be the case that we could have started supporting 100,000 individuals if we'd gone individual or the consumer route, but we felt like it was much more efficient to go to workplaces and then get access to their populations and patients that we serve in that way. And so that's the way we're trying to really get as much information about what we should be delivering and what people are missing out on today.
And I mean, we've all spoken about kind of like femtech companies needing to go further, like the gap in kind of women's healthcare research. I mean, if you collaborate with researchers, what's each of your approaches with collaborating with other femtech companies? I mean, is that just something you can't do as a startup? Or is there an element where you feel kind of like the burden of responsibility because of the space that you're in?
I would have thought everybody's open to that, because I think everybody is resource constrained. And so to the extent that, anybody can help sort of leverage what everyone else is looking after, I think we'd all be really keen to do that. And we've had lots of conversations about that, and I know that. Yeah, Tania.
And it makes good commercial sense, right? I think for a lot of femtech companies, what we found is because you're trying to educate people, right? You're trying to get people to think about a health issue they've not thought about, right? The traditional route is through doctors. A patient goes to the doctor, they tell them about this health issue. That's kind of hard to do these days in the UK, given what crisis the NHS is in. So we find, and I think other femtech companies do too, that the easiest way to amplify your message is through social, right? And then there, partnering with other femtech companies just amplifies that much more.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to do that for another side reason. So, for example, in our period pain clinic, we recommend the pelvic floor trainer to people that have chronic pelvic pain, which can be associated with also having poor muscle health in your pelvis, which has helped me when I have investor conversations with people that have invested in your company. They would Tania, so Elvie, they would usually say, oh, I can't invest in Daye because we've already invested in Elvie. I'm like, they're not competitive in any way. So I can say, well, not only are we not competitive, we're also, collaborating, promoting each other's products. So that's a nice way to ease concerns that you can only invest in one femtech company at a time.
Okay. We've got loads of questions. If you want to submit your own question, you still can. Hashtag WiredHealth2 on Slido.com. Okay, we've got one specifically for Valentina. Someone said it's heartbreaking to see the ad censorship for Daye's recent ad campaign in London. I mean, how do we as a society respond to this type of censorship? I mean, for people who don't know what happened, can you just tell everyone?
Yeah, so we had the audacity to show a tampon on an out-of-home ad in London. And we also showed a model of the uterus and the ovaries, showing where the tampon goes, so the vaginal canal. And a lot of our ads got censored across London, so people spray painted over the tampon and spray painted over the uterus or put stickers on them because there's such a deep fundamental discomfort with anything to do with gynecological health and the female anatomy. And then more recently, I've been getting feedback from investors asking me if I think our credibility with the investment community would be reduced because we ran these ads, because they're too out there. And I said, oh, what do you mean they're too out there? Said the person wearing a Volvo t-shirt. What do you mean they're too out there? And they said, well, you have a tampon in the center. And I said, well, that's the product we're promoting. So yeah, it's just deeply fundamentally uncomfortable. People are really uncomfortable with gynecological health. But we had 2 awesome people from our community just go and like clean a bunch of our ads, which was really nice.
Yeah. And just it's not just the public, right? It's also when you're paying for digital marketing spend, right? So Facebook and so on, we're constantly getting our ads censored. So there's this sort of constant work with the advertisers to keep explaining. And actually that's an example where we should be coming together a bit more collectively.
Amazon as well. So Amazon, TikTok, Google, Meta, they all block gynecological health advertising, and it's everything from breastfeeding to menopause to menstruation.
So it's all this extra work. Like not only are you doing your work, you're doing all the research, and then you're doing all the educating the advertisers. It's a lot.
And there's a huge economic penalty to that because when your accounts get blocked because you've had the courage to talk about chlamydia on Meta, then all of your learnings on your account get wiped. So all of the investment that you made to let Meta's algorithms learn which ads to show to which audience, all of that gets wiped off because of the ad being blocked.
Right. Okay. Another question. What can be done about the challenge of women's health literacy? Often for many femtech startups, the problem they want to solve has low awareness for women. Eileen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's just more conversations like this and more companies that are having to, Tania said it earlier, a lot of what we do is educating the market and the audience as well. So I think we have much more information and resources that are out there now than there were even 5 years ago, and certainly when you started. And so we're getting better, but again, that's another very low bar. And so the best we can hope for is that we continue to see more and more conversations and more content being created.
Mm-hmm. Tania, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would, because we will have to experiment with different things, right? We don't know what the right marketing strategy is or the demand generation or whatever it is you want to call this education gap. I think we find, like, if you think about taboo, it's something that's stigmatized, it's negative, it's got shame associated with it. So what we find works is either if you can turn that shame into like anger that we as women and don't have control of our bodies, or there's something, that our adverts have been banned and so on, or even what works even better, which we've managed to do more with the breast pump than say pelvic floor training, because it's difficult still. Pelvic floor health is way more taboo than breast pumping. With breast pumping, it's gone from something which was embarrassing and women felt negatively about, and we turned it into something positive, right? So any taboo, if you can switch it from negative to positive, then it becomes shareable. And that's the only way really to scale, because you can't go around educating every individual. So that's kind of our secret sauce in terms of what we try to do at Elvie.
Okay, amazing. We've run out of time. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for your questions.